Hi, I'm Emma Silverman, and welcome to Antispiral, your weekly dose of hope, wins, reality checks, all broken down so you don't spiral too hard. Welcome to episode 3. Let's get into it. First of all, I wanted to start with a bit of housekeeping. For those of you who follow and watch and are probably here from my TikTok, I wanted to let you know that I'm not intentionally avoiding the conversation about the war on TikTok. That would be insane. I've tried posting about it multiple times. Most of those videos were taken down. And by the way, those videos were just me reporting on the situation, something that we literally saw in the news, and citing my sources, the way I do with pictures at the bottom. And those pictures were the only pictures in the video. You know, the way I put the news squares at the bottom, saying what I'm talking about. Like, no other images were included, and no violence was discussed. I mean, the most violent thing I said was war. And then poof, the magic shadow banning wand was waved in my direction. So that's why you'll find some information about it baked into my other videos very broadly and not in detail. And it's also why you'll hear me calling it a conflict, because that seems to pass by the TikTok reviewers, or whatever AI they have in place to do that. But that gave my account a review marker / warning since I kept trying to post about it. So in order to avoid that, I am trying to avoid talking in detail about it, or if I do talk about it, keep it very brief and bake it into another video that's not necessarily all about the war itself. For the time being, I will be reposting my thoughts and information and updates on it instead, until that review marker's off my account, or until I can find a way to talk about it without getting flagged, you know? And no, I don't know why the TikTok gods chose me to pick on, because I watch people talk about it every fucking day, and nothing happens to them. And of course, I've tried appealing, and I've tried reaching out to them to obviously no avail, and YouTube seems to be a lot more forgiving in that regard, so I just wanted to call that out. That'll do it on the housekeeping. Let's get on to the first segment, Headache of the Week. Now, I know what you might be thinking. It would have to be Trump 2 weeks in a row because of the whole Pope debacle. But I'm more creative than that, you know? So much so that this is actually a group of people rather than an individual who have given me a huge headache for the past week. And Donald Trump will get an honorable mention ribbon pinned to his science fair project that is teeming with the ramblings of a dementia-ridden mad scientist with dry drool on his chin. But I will avoid giving it to him 2 weeks in a row if I can, so that the segment doesn't get repetitive. And also so I can call out news that you might have missed, because I think this is a great opportunity for that. So, the Headache of the Week award goes to the whole entire group of people who have so much to say about Eric Swalwell's allegations of sexual assault, but absolutely nothing to say about Tony Gonzalez's accusations or the accusations against the literal president of the United States. It obviously in that group of Headaches of the Week is Eric Swalwell, Tony Gonzalez, and Donald Trump by default. But I didn't want to make the three of them Headache of the Week on their own because I feel like that minimizes the impact of their actions. And I didn't want to do that. And before I go on, I want to make it very clear. Eric Swalwell should resign from Congress and he should face consequences. There is no debate or argument about that at all. And as of last week, he has resigned from Congress. And I talked about this on TikTok a little bit too, but we are seeing a very clear difference between the parties when it comes to accountability. Because the left immediately called Swalwell out and withdrew endorsements and encouraged his resignation. He was alienated off the bat. Why is it doing that? Okay, I think that's better. If the screen starts like flashing for some reason, I don't know why that was happening for a second. If you're watching the video version of this, I don't know why that's happening. I just tried adjusting the lighting in the camera, so hopefully it doesn't. Getting back to what I was talking about, you also have people like Tony Gonzalez, who was also accused of sexually assaulting a former staff member who later killed herself. Actually, it was two. It was two former staffers. There was another one as well. And he was fully ready to remain in Congress and just drop his bid for re-election as atonement. What are we talking about? Like, he was just going to stay. He was just going to stay in Congress and then be like, oh, I just won't run again, you know? That's crazy. Like, because it was only when Eric Swalwell's allegations surfaced and his resignation was demanded that Gonzalez finally said that he would be resigning too. And part of me thinks Mike Johnson is at least a little responsible for this, because if Gonzalez were to have resigned when his accusations surfaced, Mike Johnson's Republican House majority would have dwindled even more than it already has. And we know that's all he fucking cares about, so. But now, since a Democratic representative is also resigning, it's 1 for 1, you know, it's a level playing field. He probably thinks it's okay now, which is batshit, by the way. Absolutely batshit. But more importantly, our literal president has credible allegations of sexual assault from 27 women and children. Children. I want to make sure you heard that. Hey, what? And he's president of the United States. I believe the women and I believe the girls. But for those people who are calling out Swalwell, but still supporting Trump and not calling out Tony Gonzalez, you can't just believe women when it suits your political goals. What the fuck is wrong with you? Genuinely, what the fuck is wrong with you? I don't understand how somebody can be so awful and so evil from their core to think like that. How? Sexual assault is not a political toy or issue to leverage out of convenience. Are you fucking out of your mind? How have people become so desensitized to sexual assault? I need to know. It's a real and traumatizing experience, and women should not have to watch their abuser hold public office and avoid consequences. I don't know when we got to this place where it became so normalized for somebody who has committed a crime, a sexual crime, somebody who has committed sexual assault, somebody who has committed rape, to be in government. What the fuck is wrong with you? We have become so desensitized to this. Not we, actually. Hold on, I'm going to take myself out of that. Some people have become so desensitized to this. And I'm going to, keep going with what I wanted to say about, Headache of the Week and Underdog of the Week. Because if I were to sit and rant about this, I could do it for hours and hours because it infuriates me so much. Women shouldn't have to sit back and watch their abuser be in public office. I mean, too many women in general just have to watch their abuser walk free. With no consequences, let alone sit in government. Fuck that. So yeah, Swalwell should resign, and he should face consequences. There, again, no argument about that. No one should be out here defending him. But so should Tony Gonzalez, who finally only is because it's convenient for him to do so. And so should Trump, who never will, yet who has the most accusations under his belt. Let me remind you that Trump is also an adjudicated rapist. Hey. Remember E. Jean Carroll? Also, your reminder, I know I talked about this last episode, but 6 people in his cabinet have documented verifiable connections to Jeffrey Epstein. 7, including himself. Give me a break. So no, you don't get to pick and choose which allegations and which women you believe and which you don't. It's either they should all face consequences, which should objectively be the correct choice, if you're not a raging piece of shit and a pedophile protector. I mean, that should be the default position. Because your only other option is that none of them should face consequences, which, if that's your opinion, makes you a raging piece of shit and makes you a pedophile protector. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. At this point, if you still support Trump, you are a pedophile protector. You are a pedophile supporter, actually. That's an inarguable statement. I mean, if you can reconcile with him being in the Epstein files to support his policy, which, by the way, what fucking policy of his would you even support at this point? That just makes you a fucking moron. But yeah, if you can reconcile with him being in the Epstein files to continue to support him, you are a pedophile protector. No way around it. All right, enough of that. Let's get on to the rest of the episode. It will be good vibes, I promise. All of the bad shit is out of the way. On to the second segment, time for our Underdog of the Week. And this one I wanted to highlight because it really embodies the entire premise of this podcast, which is hope. But the Underdog of the Week award goes to the one, the only, the Hungarian, Peter Magyar. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, so I'm just going to call him Peter going forward. And this award goes to him for helping to finally topple a long-dominant authoritarian regime. He's set to become the new Prime Minister of Hungary, defeating Viktor Orban and his party, who have held power for the past 16 years. I want you to think about that for a second. 16 years. How old were you 16 years ago? I was, 11? Oh my God. I was 11 years old. I'm 27 right now. I was 11 years old when Viktor Orban got into power. And they just ousted him. But after this election, Viktor's party looks like it's secured around 55 of the parliament's 199 seats. They only have 55 seats now. Guess how much they held before? They held 135, or I guess they currently hold 135, but they will hold 55 after all of this goes into place, which he conceded already, so it will go into place. Peter's party will control 138, more than Viktor's party holds right now. And Peter showed up out of nowhere and immediately did better than all of the people who have been trying and failing for years. He was severely less funded than Viktor, had less media access, it was very unexpected, very underdoggy, if you will. And while Viktor was in power, his succession of governments, stop me if you've heard this one before. Stop me when you've heard this one before. His succession of governments passed judicial reforms that weakened the independence of Hungarian courts. Viktor's party also undermined the powers of the country's anti-corruption bodies. And Viktor also presided over the erosion of the press and academic freedoms and backtracking on the rights of minorities. It couldn't get any more familiar. I mean, does it sound familiar? Because it should. It's a direct parallel to what Trump is doing here. A direct parallel, which is why Trump publicly supported Viktor. And I mean, J.D. Vance literally went to Hungary to campaign for him. And he lost. They lost. The party lost. And that should feel really good. You should take that as a win. And yeah, I know this isn't related to US politics, but it kind of is, because it shows that there's movement. And again, like I said, it's the entire premise of this podcast, which is hope. Let this be your reminder that no matter the advantages, no matter the power dynamics, no matter the overwhelming feeling of exhaustion and defeat, all regimes fall one way or another. We can vote ourselves out of this. I'm sure Hungary was exhausted. I'm sure Hungary felt defeated. I'm sure Hungary could see the power imbalance and the way the dynamics were working against Peter, and his party still won. Have hope, because it is there. But yeah, I had to make him Underdog of the Week because that was just such a good underdog story. But I did also want to give an Underdog of the Week close second medal to Pope Leo. In my head, the Vatican is going crazy right now. And it's not an honorable mention. It's not a ribbon. It's a medal. Let's make that very clear. And this is because after being virtually harassed by Trump on Truth Social, the man held his ground. And he actually doubled down, because originally he was, criticizing the Trump administration. And then Trump came out calling him, weak on crime and that he's catering to the radical left. And then the Pope came out and not only just stood his ground, but also said, I'm not afraid of the Trump administration. Which the reason I think that was very underdoggy of him is because conservatives love to think of themselves as the party of faith and the party of traditional family values and all of that. Family values my ass. Trump's on his third wife and he cheated on at least one of them. Very publicly, too. Also, Christian values my ass. The man is openly racist, has committed adultery, is an adjudicated rapist, and is implicated in the Epstein files. Christian values my ass. But my point is that the reason it's underdoggy is that we often think people of religious esteem will bend the knee to Trump. But Pope Leo didn't. I just can't believe he said that the Pope was weak on crime. Absolutely insane take from a man who is in the Epstein files over 1 million times and who still has 6 members of his cabinet who are also connected to Epstein. He also has 34 felonies, but the Pope is weak on crime. The Pope is weak on crime. Okay, sure. Fucking moron. He also posted and then quickly deleted a photo depicting himself as Jesus. And this part's actually hilarious. When he received backlash from his staunchly Catholic supporters for portraying himself as a false idol, he then claimed that it was him working as a doctor for the Red Cross. But that's not even the funniest part, is that shortly after that, a report came out that Caroline Leavitt said that the photo of him depicted as Jesus was doctored. So the rumors going around right now is that Caroline Leavitt told Trump to tell the press that it was a doctored image, and then Trump came out and said that it was him posing as a doctor because he didn't understand what Caroline Leavitt was trying to tell him. Me if I had dementia. But yeah, the Pope held his ground, and when asked actually about Truth Social as an app, he literally said it's ironic, the name of the site itself, which, hey, burn, albeit obvious burn, very obvious burn, but a burn nonetheless. He also created distance between himself and Pete Hegseth after old Petey Boy called the war in Iran a Christian mission, which Pete had the opportunity to break the centuries-long mold for religion being the cause of most wars, but no, he brought religion in for fun. And I'm not religious, nor do I fall under any religion myself, but I'm pretty sure the Bible or Jesus or real Christians in general would call Trump's picture of himself blasphemous. But what else is new? I'm sure the part of his base that has that chum bucket helmet on super tight ate that shit up. But I do know a large chunk of them were actually able to get that helmet off and see him for who he is. The Antichrist. Which is why I'm not surprised that he isn't getting along with the leader of the Catholic Church. I mean, most evil people wouldn't. But enough about the Pope and the man in the diaper and the alcoholic war guy. Let's get on to the main segment, the breakdown. And this is an episode I've actually wanted to make since I started this podcast, because I want everyone to refer back to it when you're feeling anxious or stressed, or if you start to feel yourself slipping back into doomerism. Because today I'm going to focus on all of the ways that the system is working to not only uphold democracy, but also working against Trump's attempts to dismantle it. Because at the end of the day, when you read an article about the SAVE Act or some election executive order that Trump signed, or something else related to elections, I'll use the SAVE Act here, for example. When the SAVE Act was in its early stages of gaining traction in the media, all of the articles would be like, oh, this is who would be disenfranchised if the SAVE Act passed, or a look into this anti-democracy bill, or Republicans want to strip away the right to vote with this new bill, things along those lines, which, at its core is fear-mongering for clicks. for engagement. Because even then, they knew that Republicans wouldn't have the votes or the mechanisms in place to pass the bill to begin with. I mean, John Thune made that very, very clear from the beginning. But you rarely, if ever, saw headlines about how it wasn't going to pass, because that's not the kind of, fear-mongering that gets clicks that they love to use. Which, in my opinion, personally, I think hope-mongering would get a lot more clicks. If early on they posted something about how the SAVE Act wasn't going to pass, I think that would get a lot more engagement than all of this fear-mongering stuff. Because I don't know about you, but I'm less inclined to click the doomerism articles. And I do so that I can read about the things that I want to debunk and that I want to, point out why they're not going to work. But I know a lot of people who are very disenchanted by politics and very disenchanted by headlines and the news and generally avoid it. I'm sure they would read a lot more articles if they pointed out how this shit wouldn't work and pointed out about all the things that are failing, because you rarely ever hear about that. All you hear about is the dangerous shit, which again, I think it's good to be informed on that as well, to know what Trump is trying to do. But I think it's equally as important to be informed on all of the ways that, it doesn't work. And that's exactly what I want to highlight today. What is not being highlighted in the news. Because for every Trump is trying to do this article, there is either a paragraph within it or a much less engaged with, but Trump can't do this article, or a judge ruled against this article, or a Republicans don't have the votes to do this article. They're harder to find, but you just have to look for them. And before everyone says oh, Trump doesn't care what the judges say and Trump will do whatever he wants, he can get away with everything. He doesn't care about the law. That's not how it works here. That's not how it works in elections, because the president doesn't control elections. And of course, people are going to say, oh, but he can control what he wants. He can try to do whatever he wants. But that's the very doomerism mindset of it. That's just not true. In order for Trump to actually interfere with an election, he would need states' cooperations. It's impossible for him to do it on his own. The system is working. It's just quieter than Trump. One thing I think it's important to point out that not a lot of people think about is that U.S. election systems are intentionally, keyword intentionally decentralized and intentionally controlled by multiple institutions, in this case states, which makes top-down interference very hard to pull off, if not impossible. Because like I said, if Trump wanted to pull that off, he would need cooperation from the states. And he would also need people to not sue the states that are cooperating, because that's also happened as well. States have said oh, I'll do this with Trump, I'll do this for Trump. And then they've received lawsuits that stop them from even doing it for Trump. But yeah, something that I'll say now, and something that will probably be referred to throughout the episode, is that U.S. elections are run by the states, not the president. Article 1, Section 4, chew on that. Chew on that. And because of that, most federal attempts to control elections hit legal limits very quickly, especially with all the attempts that claim that there's widespread voter fraud when that isn't even true and there's no evidence of that at all. This is your reminder that after the 2020 election, the Trump campaign hired somebody named Ken Block, and he was hired specifically to find instances of voter fraud. And he came out in 2024 stating unequivocally that the 2020 presidential election was not stolen and that there was no evidence of voter fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election. Someone from Trump's own camp said that. His election fraud claims were even debunked by his own legal team, his own attorney general at the time, Bill Barr, who literally called him detached from reality for spreading those claims. I mean, come on, his own team were ops. Not ops, they were ops to him, but, teammates of democracy for a very brief period of time. Obviously, I'm not giving them any credit, because they still helped him spread them to begin with. I mean, also in March of this year, Trump's own FBI closed an investigation into Nevada, where they again claimed a bunch of voter fraud, and they claimed that non-citizens were voting, their tactic that they love to do. And they closed that investigation after finding less than 0.01% of registered voters in Nevada were non-citizens. Again, such a non-issue. But yeah, I want to go over the moves that the Trump administration has made to attempt to interfere with the midterm elections and the mechanisms in place that have prevented those attempts from coming to fruition. Because like I said, and believe it or not, the system is working. It's just quieter than Trump. And so the first attempt I wanted to go over was the executive orders. And I'm sure some of us remember this, but in 2025, he issued a really long-winded executive order titled Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections executive order, which aimed to restrict mail-in ballots, create federal voter eligibility lists. It forced states to coordinate with his administration and also imposed those documentation requirements like proof of citizenship, all of that. And when I say restricted mail-in ballots, it would penalize any states that count mail-in ballots after Election Day that were postmarked by Election Day. That whole fight that Trump just won't put down. Which something kind of interesting about that is, as of right now, multiple states, including Nevada, Texas, and Virginia, count ballots after Election Day that are postmarked by Election Day. So very interesting, number of Republican states that are in there and swing states. And when I say like forcing states to cooperate with him and to listen to his presidential directives, a big part of that was Trump threatening to withhold funding from the states that refused to comply with him, which that'll be important in a little, actually. So remember that. And then the documentation requirements was that he wanted to require people to show a passport or a similar document proving citizenship when registering to vote. Sound familiar? Because that's essentially the SAVE Act. And that's also a failed attempt, but it's a little different. And I'll get into that in a second. Now, is all of this legal? No. And I'll concede exactly what you guys are thinking. When has Trump ever cared about law and order or whether something's legal or not? I mean, the man has 34 felonies and 1 million mentions in the Epstein files under his belt and still ran for president under the guise of draining the swamp. Hello? He is the swamp. Anyways, multiple organizations and groups sued and won, by the way. Federal judges permanently blocked those attempts and said that the president lacks the authority to change the election procedures and that those powers rest with Congress and the states. Hello? Duh. Which these rulings eliminated key provisions in the order so that it couldn't fully take effect. Which I'm sure you didn't hear a lot about that. I'm sure you heard a lot of rumblings about what's in the executive order that he signed last year, but you probably didn't hear a whole lot about how it failed. My point exactly. Shout out to the groups that sued. Congressional Democrats, the League of Women Voters Education Fund, King Mark Elias, by the way, keeper of democracy and protector of the realm. And the tavern said, long may he reign. Long may he reign. Love Game of Thrones. But yeah, that 2025 executive order didn't work. So that's why he came out with that other executive order this past month, back in March of this year, 2026. And this order was similar but different. This one would limit when ballots can be sent, and it directed USPS to only deliver ballots to approved voters, and it pushed a national voter verification system, which of course, immediately hit with multiple lawsuits from over 20 states and civil rights groups. And I'm sure you're thinking, it sounds very similar to his last executive order. Of course, it's essentially the same thing. There's a few differences, but it's very, very similar. And I want to point out that this executive order was signed at the height of controversy. People were still talking a lot about the Epstein files, and he was like in the midst of entering us into a war that we didn't need to be in. And so I think this was him flooding the zone. I'll say it. I think this was him flooding the zone because a lot of these provisions have already been struck down in court, and he still signed the order anyways. I think that he knew this was going to fail, but he just wanted another story to get people's minds off of the Epstein files and to get people's minds off of, the war we were going to enter into, or had already entered into, actually. And I'm not trying to say, it was a distraction. It was a distraction. I think flooding the zone is very different than a distraction because people are still focused on that, but giving them so many things to focus on makes people put less hyper focus on each individual thing. So yeah, it's pretty doomed. And first, very simply, he doesn't have the authority to do this. Multiple courts, including this court, have said the same thing. And the second thing I'll point out that a lot of people will probably disagree with me on is that the Supreme Court isn't in his pocket when it comes to, constitutional issues. The tariffs case proved that. When the Supreme Court said he exceeded his authority by imposing those tariffs, he exceeded his constitutional authority. I mean, if that wasn't enough proof, look at how the justices are reacting to his fight against birthright citizenship. They're very skeptical about it. I would be surprised if it's not 9-0. More like 8-1 because Alito and Thomas love to be pains in the ass sometimes. But yeah, the president doesn't have authority to run elections that are held within the states. And we know that he knows that this is all a check to his power because of all the measures he is taking to force states to comply with him. For instance, threatening to withhold funding. Like I said before, that's why it's important to remember, because he wouldn't threaten those states and threaten to withhold funding if he thought that he could do this on his own. He knows that he needs the states. He knows that he needs their cooperation to be able to pull anything off with regards to the elections. That's why he's trying to threaten them. That's why he's trying to hold leverage over them. But it's not going to work. It already hasn't worked. Executive orders don't mean shit, especially to state governments. He knows that it's only the states and Congress that can actually do something. And this actually brings me to my next failed attempt, which is the SAVE Act. For those of you who don't know, which I'd be surprised, the SAVE Act is the disenfranchisement bill that is attempting to disenfranchise around 21 million people. And I just want to point out, before I talk about how it's already doomed, even if it was going to pass, which it's not, it wouldn't even be upheld in the courts. Let's make that very, very clear. But it's not going to pass to begin with. It's DOA. And of course, it was based on all of his false claims about non-citizens voting in elections, which we all know isn't true and has been totally debunked. You can look anything up relating to this. Anything. You probably won't even be able to find a source that says that non-citizens voting is a substantial amount of voter fraud enough to change an election. You won't. But yeah, this SAVE Act was a result of them claiming that non-citizens had been voting for so long. And like I said, it was a lie of a claim. There was no evidence behind it. Rudy Giuliani made this claim in court in 2020 for Trump, and then he got disbarred in the state of New York for knowingly making false and misleading statements to courts. Hey, Giuliani, how'd that work out? Haven't heard from the man since 4 seasons Total Landscaping. Which, by the way, still the funniest thing that has ever happened in American history. But a very, brief and broad overview. I don't want to go too deep into it because it's not going to pass. It would have blocked around 21 million American citizens who lack access to the documents that would be required to register to vote, because you'd no longer be able to use your license or your state ID. You'd have to use other forms of documentation, like a passport and a birth certificate. And I know everyone points this out, but think of the millions of women whose married names are obviously not on their birth certificates, unless they married somebody in their family, which we all know Republicans love to do disproportionately. And they also probably don't have their married last name on their passports unless they immediately went and got a passport right after they got married. But the other major problem with it is that these documents cost money. That is, say it with me, a poll tax. If you said illegal, that also would have been correct. And there is overlap between this and the 2025 executive order. The executive order differs from the SAVE Act in that it did not necessarily permit voters to show birth certificates as part of its show your papers requirement. And then the SAVE Act is also different because it would effectively eliminate the popular methods of voter registration. Because in order to register, you would have to go to a government office in person to do it, which Republicans definitely know that this is a form of disenfranchisement. I mean, go up to them and ask them the last time they willingly went to a place like the DMV to get something done. I'm sure all you'll find is a lot of expired car registrations. But yeah, it did pass the House. Mike Johnson, the obedient soldier for Trump that he is, got it through. But the way it's been stopped is that it's stalled in the Senate. And it's not going to go anywhere from here. It's beyond saving at this point. And Republicans have actually been acknowledging that too, that they don't have the votes to get it through, especially since they would need 60 votes to pass it. Hey, all Democrats and even a few Republicans are against it. Good luck, Charlie. And the only other way they could get it through or get it past this 60 vote threshold is to get rid of the filibuster. And they don't have the votes to do that either, because Republicans know, well, some Republicans know that it's not worth it to get rid of the filibuster because they're facing an election year where Dems are likely to take power in the House and probably the Senate. And if the Dems take power in a Senate without a filibuster, they can take advantage of that too, which is why there's enough Republicans that oppose getting rid of the filibuster. So it can't get through that way either. It can't get through with votes. Let's be clear about that. And so their last ditch effort is another way of getting things through the Senate called reconciliation. But that's not going to work either. Reconciliation is only for passing budgetary items and budgetary measures. For instance, the one big beautiful bill passed through reconciliation, but the SAVE Act isn't a budgetary item and it can't be attached to a budgetary item to pass through. There's a person in the Senate who is called the Senate parliamentarian who looks through all of the stuff, who combs through all of the bills to make sure that each item in there is a budgetary measure. And before you say, oh, they're going to let it go through, the Senate parliamentarian is not a Republican. And they always throw shit out, especially when they suspect that a party is trying to skirt a filibuster. It's happened multiple times. That would be the most public, skirting of a filibuster there's been in years. And a lot of Republicans have already acknowledged that reconciliation isn't a viable option. It isn't even an option at all at this point. They know they're not going to win this battle, and they know it's over. Even Trump knows this. I mean, he literally said that it's too hard to get it through because of the rules of the Senate, which is another reason why he came out with that executive order right after. It's because the SAVE Act wasn't going to work. So he was like, what else can I do? So now they know that it's going to fail, but they're just doing it to get Democrats on record as being, anti-voter ID so that they can use the Democrats are anti-voter ID messaging, especially ahead of the midterms, which is their attempt to sow distrust now so that people think that a blue wave in November is because Democrats opposed voter ID. And if you believe that, you have fallen for Republican propaganda. Let's make that very clear. And in that same vein of how, media frames messages, something very interesting that went on while they were talking about reconciliation is that you finally saw media outlets saying Republicans are going to try to pass the SAVE Act using reconciliation. And then the article would be about how it's not going to work. And I was pretty happy to see that because I think it was important to point out that this, ancient method that is only for budgetary items is not going to get the SAVE Act through. I think that was a very, very important thing to point out because people were worried about it. But then you looked at outlets like Fox News and their article would be like, oh, Republicans have one more shot to get the SAVE Act through. And then there'd be one tiny paragraph in there about how it's probably not going to work. So if you're ever wondering why someone in your family or one of your friends watches Fox News and has such a different perspective, I think that's a great example to talk about with them or just to talk about in general of how different messaging is worded with Fox versus NPR or AP or anything like that, which obviously we all know this, but that was just a very specific example I could pull out of my pocket if you ever wanted to show somebody that. But yeah, even if they wanted to use the Democrats or anti-voter ID messaging, I don't think it would work because it's kind of funny, actually. Republicans have ironically put so much press on this SAVE Act that most people know how this bill has nothing to do with being pro or anti-voter ID. I mean, especially because of the whole, married women thing, how much married women would be affected. And even if they change that one thing in it, the public, especially married people, kind of see it for what it is now because Republicans put so much press on it. So if Republicans, want to use the Dems or anti-voter ID messaging, I truly do not think it'll work at this point. But yeah, we covered the executive order of 2025, which was shut down in court. We covered the executive order of 2026, which will be shut down in court, is currently being shut down in court. And now we've covered the SAVE Act, which is DOA in the Senate. The next action from the Trump administration that I want to talk about as a failed attempt to interfere with the midterm elections is the whole redrawing of the maps war. So for those of you who don't know, last year, Trump went to the skid mark of a governor, Greg Abbott, and Trump asked him to redraw the maps in Texas to give Republicans a shot at winning more seats in the House come midterm elections. And I'm pretty sure it is comfortably an extra 1 to 3 seats now. And this created like a big domino effect of Republican states stepping up and trying to help Trump out, trying to say, oh, we'll redraw our maps for you, of course, because, I want to stick my nose up your ass, says the Republican states. And it also led to a domino effect of the Democratic states saying, oh, you guys want to redraw your maps to add Republican seats? Well, we can redraw ours and add Democratic seats. Now we're at this point where he's not even winning the war necessarily, one that he started. Hey, sound familiar? For instance, Indiana, the Republicans actually refused to redistrict the way that Trump asked them to. Also in Kansas and New Hampshire, GOP officials also resisted Trump's efforts there. So the domino effect for Republicans wasn't as, massive as it was for Democrats. Because in California, people voted to approve a map that would give Democrats 5 more seats, which it was so funny when Republicans were mad about that. Hey, who started it? And something interesting I want to point out is that this is all based on patterns from last election, from 2024. And I don't think that it's going to be really in Republicans' favor anymore because we're seeing more people than ever come out who say, hey, I voted for Trump in 2024, but I'm not going to vote for him again. And these voters are the people who actually influence elections, by the way. These on-the-fencers and party switchers. And I'm not saying, they're all going to come over and vote for Democrats. I mean, the sane ones will. The sane ones will say, oh, I'm going to vote blue because those are actual on-the-fencers and actual party switchers. And then the insane ones are probably just not going to vote because they're so disappointed in this administration. And of course, there's the crazies that, are still going to vote for him and vote for all these Republicans. But yeah, like for instance, with the patterns from 2024, Trump had a huge amount of Hispanic support in Texas, but that's kind of dwindled since the start of his presidency. So redrawing any district in Texas based off of Trump's 2024 support with the Hispanic community in Texas is probably going to backfire. But yeah, I just wanted to call that out because I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. But this whole redrawing maps war is coming down to Virginia and Florida. So in Virginia, Democrats are trying to pass a pretty aggressive redistricting map that would eliminate as many as 4 Republican-leaning districts. And the election day to vote on that is actually April 21st. So if you live in Virginia, have a plan. And then in Florida, there was supposed to be a session to consider redrawing, but old Ronnie boy, Ron DeSatan, is now thinking about delaying that. And I think it's for one of 2 reasons, maybe both. First, some Republicans in the state are worried that the newly drawn aggressive maps could end up having the reverse effect and could actually end up costing Republicans some seats. They're worried that's going to affect incumbents, and they're worried with how, unpredictable the 2024 red voters are, which is what I was just talking about with Texas, by the way, especially with Trump's, worst approval rating of his second term. And this was all fueled by the shock of a Dem winning Mar-a-Lago. Hey, shout out Emily Gregory. And the second reason is that there's a major legal hurdle that they would have to clear because Florida voters passed an amendment in 2010 that effectively banned partisan gerrymandering in the state. So I mean, them trying to redraw maps for the sole purpose of a partisan gerrymandering war would require some other justification, one that they just don't have. Your reminder that Dems have flipped over 24 seats in congressional and state and local elections since Trump was elected, and Republicans have flipped 0. Okay, so we covered the 2025 executive order, the 2026 executive order, the SAVE Act, the redrawing of the maps war, and the last one I want to cover, the last move that Trump made to attempt to interfere with the midterm elections is when he asked Republicans in Congress to nationalize elections. I'm sure we all remember that, which one, that's not how elections work. Like I said, Article 1, Section 4, chew on that, which again, another time I think he tried to flood the zone because this was peak Epstein news coverage. And it's also just not how elections work. Hello? What? I mean, notice how you haven't heard about it since? He mentioned it right before he got us into a pointless war and right in the middle of all the headlines being about Epstein. Specifically, his connections to Epstein. And if anything, I think this headline should actually comfort you when you read between the lines of it. Because notice how it was Trump asked Republicans in Congress and Trump urged Republicans in Congress to do it. Because he knows he can't do it himself. He knows he doesn't have the power to do that. So he was asking Congress because he knows that only Congress can. And again, it's not one of those things where he says like, oh, if Republicans aren't going to do it, I'm going to do it. He can't. The literal only way to nationalize elections would be if Republicans passed something. That's not going to happen. That would be an amendment to the Constitution. They would need 2/3 majority of both chambers to pass it. They can't even get the SAVE Act through. And then not only that, they would need 38 states to agree to pass it, to ratify it. So yeah, good luck, Charlie. But that was only, if he was being serious. He wasn't actually being serious. And he actually can't do that. And I don't know how much more I can emphasize that this isn't me saying, oh, he can't do that. And then you have the ability to think like, oh, well, he can do whatever he wants. He always does whatever he wants. Like nothing's going to stop him, There's no mechanism in place for him to carry out nationalizing elections besides Congress. And Congress can't do it. Therefore, it's not going to happen. You can believe what I'm saying, or you could run with a doomerism mindset. That's really all I can tell you right now, is that it's not going to happen because it can't. And, on that note of things that he can't do because it's logistically impossible, he can't cancel midterms. They're already going on. We're voting in the primaries right now. And a lot of people love to say that, oh, he could say that we're in a war and then he could cancel them because of that. Hey, no, he can't. We've held elections during wars. We held an election during the Civil War when everything was on our own turf. It was just us. So get that out of your head. Also, even if he were to say, like, I don't want to hold elections, states could come out and be like, well, we're holding an election for our state. So, but that's not going to happen. Again, he can't do that. And on that note, too, he can't deploy ICE agents to every polling place. Again, not something he's even officially attempted, but still something I just wanted to point out that he cannot do. It is logistically impossible. There's an estimated 94,000 polling places in the US. 94,000. Do you know how many ICE agents there are? 20,000. And a lot of people are saying like, oh, he's gonna just put them at, swing states. I hope states can literally put laws in place that ICE agents can't be at polling centers. They can say, oh, you know what? If Trump wants to deploy ICE, we're gonna put a law in place that ICE can't be there. Because again, like I said, states run their own elections. And another example of how, there's mechanisms in place that makes top-down interference so hard. So I wouldn't be worried about that either. But in the chance that you do see one, which I truly don't think will be the case, cast your vote and go home. I want you to hear that again. If there is an ICE agent at your polling center, cast your vote and go home. Because if one is there, they're only there to rile people up and to get a reaction. They're not there to do anything relating to protecting the polling center. Are we kidding? Cast your vote and leave. But again, it's extremely unlikely and logistically impossible to have them at every polling center. Bottom line of it all, every major pathway hits a barrier. Executive orders are blocked or challenged in court. State pressure is limited by state authority. Legislation is blocked by Democrats. Red states redrawing maps is evened out by blue states redrawing maps. Federal takeover ideas are logistically impossible. So I just want to reiterate what I said in the beginning, which is that U.S. election systems are intentionally decentralized, which makes top-down interference very hard, damn near impossible to pull off, which is why he hasn't pulled it off. The systems are working, they're just quieter than Trump. I need you to remember that. But I think I'll leave it there, actually. I've rambled a pretty good amount of time again. Now for my hot take and non-political segment of this podcast, so you can leave this zone better than you found it. And this one might ruffle some feathers. We need to stop making spin-offs. Hey, let me explain. Put your guns down. Everybody put your guns down. You, Dexter, guns down. Okay, everyone's guns are down. We can have a conversation now. So far with things like Harry Potter, it has not worked at all. At all. It's actually making me upset. And we'll see how this new one turns out, I guess. But so far, I'm not impressed. And I don't have high hopes for it. I'll be honest. I don't think it'll work with Stranger Things unless they confirm whether or not Eleven is alive. Other than that, it's just kind of useless and will probably create more plot holes, honestly. The Dexter spinoffs weren't awful, but they were nothing compared to the actual show, Dexter. Original sin can live since it's like the backstory. But, actually, even then I can do without. So, no, never mind. Sorry. And by the way, when I say I'm a fan of Harry Potter, I am a fan of Harry Potter, not J.K. Rowling. Fuck you, lady. But yeah, I would say that the only one that might have been slightly good, still not as good as the original show, but not awful, was Better Call Saul. Because I love Breaking Bad, and I didn't hate Better Call Saul. Do I think it was as good as Breaking Bad? No. Oh, and House of the Dragon. But again, I don't think that, competes with Game of Thrones. Aside from the ending, but, any video in my camera roll would have beaten the ending of Game of Thrones. So that's not like a feat to accomplish. But as for like Harry Potter and those other big shows and movies, Let the art exist. Leave it alone. A shitty spin-off will only drive people away. But I would love to hear everyone else's opinion there, or if you have a spin-off suggestion that you think is good, would love to hear it. So if you have a good spin-off, put it in the comments. And if you agree with me and you have another example of a bad spin-off, also put it in the comments. Calls to action. You already know, check your voter registration if you haven't already. It's important. Link is in the description, as always. Virginia, you can vote on April 21st for those new maps that they drew. California, you don't have to worry about the special election for Swalwell's seat until August 18th, but I just wanted to get that on your radar right now. Other call to action, if you haven't watched Harry Potter, give it a shot. Or actually wait until winter because it's much cozier then. That's usually when I rewatch it. And last call to action is to have hope. And to hold on to it too, especially after seeing what happened in Hungary. I mean, let that serve as your reminder that it can be done, that we can vote ourselves out of this, that all regimes do fall one way or another. And on that note, celebrate your wins. Celebrate all your wins, big and small, just like I said last time. Life is so boring without them. Thank you so much for listening again. If you like it here, subscribe and stay a while. Tune in next week, tune out the noise, and abolish spinoffs. Bye.